Welcome to Grappling with the Gray, a forum for promoting an ethical mindset and ethical decision-making. Help us more clearly see both sides of complex issues and better navigate the moral challenges of everyday life. I'm Rabbi Yonason Goldson, and I would like to welcome my guests today. With me is Ed Brenegard. Did I say that right?
Yes.
Good. Who is founder and chief of Circle of Impact LLC, teaching people to think for themselves. That's still legal in some places. To act on their own initiative and to become people of impact within their organizations, communities, and institutions. Chris Parker once again joins us from Sydney, Australia. She is head of the Ethics Alliance, a community of organizations across sectors that are connected through the Ethics Center, providing ethics-based counseling, consulting, and education programs. And with us from Paris is Stuart Wiggins. He is chief advisor at Induna Advisors, working to significantly increase company revenue by developing positive client reports and establishing solid business relationships. Thank you all for being with me.
Thank you.
And here is our topic today. Last week, Jennifer Crumbley was found guilty on 4 counts of involuntary manslaughter for her role in her 15-year-old son Ethan's murder of 4 classmates in a November 2021 shooting. Ethan pled guilty in 2022 and received a life sentence with no chance of parole. This was the first time manslaughter charges were ever brought against anyone other than the actual perpetrator. Prosecutor Karen McDonald devised a novel legal theory, stretching the conventional application of the law in a way that her own legal team warned her was a huge risk. She seems to have been motivated by the belief that if parents know they can be imprisoned for their children's crimes, they will take more responsibility for their children to prevent horrific mass shootings from happening. In contrast to some other states like Texas, Michigan law does not distinguish between involuntary manslaughter and criminal negligence, the former being active and the latter being passive. Consequently, the prosecutor had to choose whether to bend the accepted understanding of the law or settle for pursuing a lesser charge carrying a much reduced sentence. So here's our question. Does it set a dangerous precedent for a prosecutor to reinterpret the law to work around lawmakers' failure to legislate proportionate responses that serve as an effective deterrent? Is it fair to Jennifer Crumbley to make an example of her when parents of worst shooters were given a pass or a slap on the wrist? And isn't there something incongruous about convicting a parent for a child's crime while simultaneously trying and convicting the child as an adult? Finally, is it possible to differentiate between one kind of judicial activism that fills necessary holes in the system and another kind that reflects the personal bias of court officials and potentially undermines the integrity of the law? Lots of ways we could go on this. The floor is open.
Well, I'll jump in. I think that the way I look at this, easily you could take this whole thing down the path of, positive and negative emotions towards guns and gun ownership. But I peeled the layer back and looked at it like this. If you have a child from the day it's conceived to 18, you have a responsibility for that individual and the growth and development of that individual. So, I don't think it's a stretch of the law to interpret that the parent has a responsibility to make sure that the child, not necessarily is law abiding, but does not break the law. For example, if a child picks up a gun around the house and shoots one of their siblings, then who's responsible? Just the child? Or is the parent responsible also? And I think in Jennifer Crumbley's case, she actually saw deteriorating mental capabilities within her son that would suggest, why do I give my child a gun? So really what it comes down to is if you talk about criminal negligence, and the definition is, what would the reasonably prudent person do? So if you're a parent and you have children and you consider yourself reasonably prudent, what would you do?
So I just want to jump in and ask you, Stuart, you said that the mother, Jennifer Crumbley, saw behavior that was threatening, but from my understanding, she didn't interpret that behavior necessarily as a threat. Other people did, the school did, you know, his drawings did, but she saw it as a bit of a normative behavior more so. So is the responsibility on her then to take on another role of psychologist, of, you know, of digging deeper into his reality, of taking him, it's just a question. I'm just wondering, because it's a perspective thing there, isn't it?
Sure it is. So I get back to the definition of what would the reasonably prudent person do? You know, if you see someone with behavior that is inconsistent with the norm, if we can kind of all agree what the norm is, then even if you're not a psychologist, you ought to at least be able to find somebody and say, my son is displaying these behaviors. Could you sit down and talk with him? Whoever that professional person is.
But I think that's the issue here. I think that's the baseline of the issue, is that people can't agree on what is the norm. You know, I was saying there's been, I wrote 640 mass shootings in the United States in 2023. What is the norm? And I think that the law is retrospective. And so it has been established on a normative society at some stage. But since that time, you know, that has changed, and the community's expectation of the outcomes of the behavior has changed. The expectations of the standards that they want to live in, of a community that abides by a set of standards, has changed. I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there.
I look at this as the state going after the weakest party in this scenario. So if she was influential on her son, but in the school saw that the son had these tendencies, why are they not culpable for addressing that with the state and removing him from the school, and maybe even removing him from the home? I mean, this to me is such a prejudicial prosecution that it sets up a problem of how does the state then relate to parents and relate to families if they're not going to hold schools culpable for the safety of their children. And, you know, this was something I was involved in with a group over 20 years ago. And we had some community discussions about school violence, particularly in the context of video game violence. And what that was, the attempt was try to hold the video game manufacturers as culpable for these children who were being trained by video games to be shooters. There was a shooting, I guess it's close to 30 years ago, I think it was in Little Rock, Arkansas, where the young man killed a number of people at the school. And the day he shot was the first day he had ever held an actual gun. Before that, he had been playing video games. And so the question is, who is really responsible in an open society?
And we come back to that again and again. I mean, there's been debate for quite a while now about whether violent video games actually promote physical violence, and I think the studies are inconclusive from what I've read. Apparently there are a lot of reasons to be critical of Jennifer Crumbley, at least what was reported, that she was in many ways not present as a parent, and that she and her husband did provide the weapon. And apparently the school did alert them that they had concerns. But, and trying to set the levels of responsibility is, that's also a very, very thorny issue. But to come back to the point that we started with, you said, Stuart, that it's perfectly reasonable to hold the parents accountable, and I don't disagree. But in this particular case, the prosecutor extended the reach of the law beyond what was considered a conventional interpretation or application. And
Let me offer two things for you, perhaps.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead.
No, I'd like to explore that issue. It's a little bit, sort of two different tracks at least that we could go down with this.
My question to you is the law a moving target? Or, like with Roe versus Wade, up until last year, it was assumed to be settled law. And then the Supreme Court went in a different way, went in a different direction with it. So just because a parent had never been prosecuted, and I want to be clear, I have 1, 2, 3, 4 cases in Michigan, Virginia, and California where parents have been prosecuted for child neglect when it comes to a gun and either injuring or killing someone. So it's not entirely unheard of.
No, that's different from manslaughter.
It is, it's the interpretation of the district attorney and what charges they want to bring.
Mm-hmm.
But if the child, Jennifer Crumbley's child, came up to her and said, can I borrow the car? Give me the car keys. Would she have given him the car keys? He's a 15-year-old. No, because it's illegal. So if she was responsible enough, and I use that just as an example, if she was responsible enough not to give him the car keys, then why would you give a 15-year-old a gun? I don't care what his behavior was leading up to that. At some point, we don't trust a child to make prudent decisions behind the wheel. Why would we trust a child with a gun or have access to it?
I don't think there's any question that she's guilty of something. The question is it the job of the prosecutor to follow the law as it has been legislated, or to try to stretch the limits of the law in a way that the prosecutor believes is going to achieve more justice?
Or maybe it's that the law is serving a moral function, and is that right?
What's the moral function?
To try to prevent future mass shootings, to put more guards in place and hold parents responsible.
Or it's being served as a political function, which would, if she was running for re-election that year, it would be a good case to make for her re-election. I think
there's no doubt that could be a factor, but if you don't mind, let's set that on the side for the moment.
That makes me sad.
Well, but I think it's reality. I think it's the reality we live, that the courts have, at least in America, they've been compromised by the political divisions that exist.
Yeah, no, I don't think there's any question of that. But let's attribute to the prosecutor the highest minded motives possible. Right? She really believes that doing what she's doing is going to help prevent further violence.
Right.
Is this a proper way to do that? Or is it, once one prosecutor does that, or once one judge does that, then it opens the door for others, and that can come back to your point, Ed, that different prosecutors, different judges have different personal biases and political agendas, perhaps, on how they want to stretch the law to fit in with their worldview.
Yeah, where do you draw that line? And I think also, when you start to bring in a line that can be moved like that, whether or not this has or not, you really it serves as a huge disadvantage to people that don't have the means to deal with the law in situations where they may have to be held responsible. What does responsibility for your child look like? And suddenly those people that can't afford a lawyer or for whatever reason, I'm concerned there'd be huge discrimination against those underprivileged members of of society as well.
I agree with you.
Yeah. I mean, I think
Well,
about cases that are, excuse me, 1 second, just I can think about cases we've heard about, probably more common, where judges give very, very lenient sentences for what many consider quite heinous crimes, because they feel that there are extenuating circumstances. So then you've got the same principle at work in the opposite direction. Yeah, Stuart, please.
No, I was just gonna offer that as we talk about this, responsibility has to be placed somewhere. And, Chris, you said there'd been over 600 mass shootings in the United States. What was the number you said?
Yeah. 600 and I dropped a
Okay.
piece of paper, but it was a lot. It was like 148 in 2023. It was a lot.
It was a lot. So then if you factor in what percent or what total number were done by children of a younger age. And I don't know what that number is, so I'm not gonna try to assign that number. But maybe a district attorney is saying, okay, what can we do as a deterrent? So the deterrent is the parent has to be held to some level of responsibility. And the law doesn't say it can't happen, because in fact, I gave 3 or 4 incidents where it's happened in other states, to include Michigan. So why can't it be used here as a possible deterrent? It doesn't eliminate mass shootings, but maybe it eliminates a percentage of the mass shootings, particularly when it comes to minors.
I think, though, that the issue is that this is the first time that the parent has actually been charged with manslaughter.
Yeah.
That's quite a different thing. That creates a huge, that's going to change this person's life. They're going to be incarcerated. They're going to be stigmatized. Like they're not just being negligent and leaving the gun unlocked in the house, or, which is bad as well. Don't get me wrong. But this is very much it's extending the responsibility of the actual outcome to the parent, which I think, and making them pay considerably for that. So I think it's a little bit different. Maybe I'm wrong.
And I'm wondering whether this choice that she made was intended as an implication of pushing this to an appellate court where they will have to decide whether this is an appropriate charge for her. And then ultimately it may end up at the Supreme Court, where this kind of legislation, this becomes a piece of legislation that then governs the nation, rather than simply in this one.
Right. I mean, I agree with you, Stuart. I mean, the case being used as an opportunity to try to curb, mass shootings. And I think that the prosecutor actually said that, sending a message to those parents out there that they need to be held responsible. But I think, I don't know, what this prosecutor is looking at is the outcome of these behaviors, the consequences of these behaviors. And, America's very much a libertarian society. And so everyone intrinsically deserves their own rights and to be responsible for themselves and to have agency of what that is. And I just, from what I've read, and it's only what I've read, so that's another whole story, whether we can trust what we're reading, but from the facts that I've read, there were a number of reasons why this prosecutor felt she could push the line. But when I looked at some of her, because I did watch some of the playback, she was doing the best job she thought she could. That's the impression I was getting, either that or she just didn't care, in a sense. I believe there was some extramarital thing that she was involved with and she was distracted, and whatever that is. Are we punishing her for being a bad parent? I don't know. I think it just opens up. I'm not saying either way, but I'm just throwing some stuff out there.
It's interesting the way you just frame it there, Chris, because I've often thought about this in terms of drunk driving. Drunk driving, if I drive home drunk and I don't hurt anybody and I don't cause any damage, have I done anything wrong? Well, yeah, I've acted negligently. I got lucky that I didn't do harm. So I'm not really, I'm being punished for a for negligent behavior that results in damage, right? And when I looked up in the Texas law, for instance, which differentiates between manslaughter and negligent homicide, they gave examples. For instance, discharging a gun in a crowd without concern, there's a lack of intent. I'm not trying to shoot anybody, but I'm acting in a way that is putting people in profound danger. I'm actively doing that, as opposed to leaving a gun around where a child can get to it. In your case, Stuart, which are horrible stories we've heard of children finding them and discharging them, that would be negligence, because it was a failure to be responsible over the situation, even though there was nothing active involved. Now, I think we can make a fairly clear distinction between those. We can argue about what kind of difference there would be in sentencing, but it was the conflation of those two is what this particular prosecutor did. And, you know, as you, and by the way, I love it when my guests do more research than I do. Brings so
Just
much
let
to
me
the
add one more little
conversation.
piece for you then. In 2013, and this was in Michigan, Patricia Nichols was convicted of involuntary manslaughter and child abuse because her 3-year-old son shot and killed himself because the gun was available to him. And part of the charges were negligence in storing the gun safely. So there was some precedence in Michigan going back to 2013. And so maybe this prosecutor was taking some latitude, but I think she did have some precedence to try to go with based on the 2013 trial.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, if that one worked then it actually opens the question, what was different about this case that made it a novel approach?
I just have to jump in just really quickly just to say, this is just such a difficult subject, you know, to talk about the consequences and the randomness. And I just feel like I have to say that because we're talking about things that are just so tragic, that are so impactful on people's lives and on the culture, and the fear that you talk about. I when I was reading a lot of this is tied to sort of possible mental health issues, etc. And I just think that's a mistake in conflating those two. Because mental health issues post-COVID have become, highlighted, and we're much more aware of it, and it is much more common. And I think it's terrible to conflate someone with mental health issues with gun issues. I just don't see that working, but I just felt like I had to say it because we're having a discussion here about children being shot by their siblings, or, it's really just really tragic. As I said, I'm Australian. We do not have a society that deals with these things on a daily basis. Like Stuart, 640 mass shootings in 2023. We had one. So for us, it is a very big deal here. That's all. I just felt like I had to say that.
No, and I appreciate that. And the truth is that you take me back to a conversation I had probably 40 years ago with an Australian. I can still I can still hear her voice saying it. I was staying in a youth hostel in Key West, Florida, and she was the manager of the hostel. And there are headlines about how somebody had if I remember correctly, drove their car into a McDonald's restaurant. One of these, acts of rage. And I still remember her saying, great country you got here. And this was before the school shootings and such, but it's something that we talk about, and we talk about And I don't see that we're getting anywhere. You know,
Maybe this,
what,
I mean, you know, this case is this prosecutor saw an opportunity
yeah,
to judicial activism, really, to jump in there and say, here's one way we can go forward to try to prevent these from happening in the future and hold parents responsible on some level. And but it, you know, at what point do you draw that line? I don't know, but
yeah, and I'm sympathetic to her intentions. You know, I do. It often comes down to one side is it has to do with guns. We need to get rid of the guns, and the other side is it comes down to culture. We have to fix the culture. Well, it's a lot easier physically to remove the guns than it is to change the culture, except for this thing called the Second Amendment, which is, as I'm sure you all know, is hotly debated. And we're not going to solve that problem today.
Well, it
Anyways.
seems to me that the problem is that the law is the avenue of last resort to dealing with this, and that we're unwilling to address the social issues that come with this. And for whatever reason, I mean, obviously this young man needed help. Obviously the parents needed help. And if there was some way for the community to have provided some kind of remedy, or if that's even the right word, we would not be talking about this. But it seems like when we get to the law being the last resort for how we address these kind of very conflicted social problems, then we really need to be asking the question, so how can we change this so that we don't have to fight all these battles in court, and that we can actually do them in our homes, in our other social institutions.
So Chris, you brought up something earlier about mental illness. Okay, just this past weekend in Austin, Texas, at Joel Osteen's church, a lady has known mental illness went into the church with an AR-15 and started shooting it. So if you look at it like a business solution, what's the root cause of the problem? We already know she has mental illness. Okay. So is it the access to the gun? If there was no access to the gun, then the mental illness would not have come into play in that fashion. Who knows? She might have tried to drive her car into the church. But the whole point is, I mean, we can break it down and say mental illness, and we can break it down and say parents' rights. But what it really boils down to is the access to the gun. I mean, you said in Australia, there's one mass shooting. Well, what's different? If you overlaid Australia, I mean, geographically, the countries are the same size. So if you overlaid Australia on the United States, what's different?
The
we
problem,
only have 2% of your population, and we don't have guns. I mean, there are
the
some.
problem, Stuart, is that the cities that have the strongest gun laws also have the highest incident of gun shootings. So I think we see that legislation doesn't fix this. Restrictions don't fix this. It's a good political case to run on, but it is, you know, I saw something the other day that the U.S. is ranked like third in the world in gun shooting deaths. But if you take out the top 5 cities in the U.S. that ranking gun shootings, you know, the U.S. drops down to somewhere in the 70s. So all of this is really concentrated in cities where there's something else going on that is not really about the gun. It's something else that's going on, which is causing the issues to arise, where guns are a means to resolving some kind of conflict that exists in that community.
Yeah, a sense of an inequality. And I think too, I mean, what percentage of I think the percentage of shootings that are done by children, because going back to this issue here, right, we're talking about the responsibility of a child and a parent's responsibility of a child. And I don't know what that is. So, you know, by these big numbers does sort of skew what we're talking about here, I think, probably.
And I think those are really a couple of very important points. I mean, it's a fascinating statistic. It's the focus is in 5 cities tilts or skews the numbers. I've often wondered, as somebody who grew up in the second most populous city in the country, and moved to a much still a big city, but nothing on that scale. You know, the whole style of living is different. I mean, going from 10 million people in a metropolitan area to 2 million people is dramatic. Take that down another order of magnitude, and very, very different quality of life. But you know, the point you just raised, Chris, I think the bottom line really, if children get their hands on guns that are owned by the parents, I think that puts the responsibility, accountability squarely on the parents' shoulders. I don't know how you get around that. If I mean, my wife doesn't want a gun in the house, and our kids are all grown up and and gone. But you know, if we would have had a gun with children around, I can't imagine not having that thing locked away in some place with layers of protection, because the consequences are just too serious to
I have to be
contemplate.
honest with you. I think we in the United States, I'm probably out of line by saying this, but I'm going to say it. I think we in the United States are so arrogant that we refuse to look at other countries and see how they're successful managing, you know, how guns are stored, how things are adjudicated, and how it's managed. You know, the Second Amendment, I think, has been misinterpreted, and we should be able to look at countries like Australia or Germany or England or Finland or other countries that don't have the problem with guns. They still have the same level of mental illness. Percentage-wise, they have the same number of children. So why is it in this country that we, I mean, 600 and some mass shootings in 2023, nobody blinks anymore, okay? What's the number? Because if Sandy Hook didn't do it, then what's the number? Because Sandy Hook was a child going into a school and shooting up a bunch of kids. So what's the number?
What's the number of these as school shootings and not, say, gang shootings, which also are a major factor in what's happening in the cities in the United States, as gangs basically have taken over in many cities, and it's one of the challenges that we're facing. I don't think there's. I think the issue of negligence is a huge one, and I think we need to talk about that before we have to go to the legislature to define that. But and I think it's us citizens who have to have that conversation. You know, when we're in a coffee shop, we're talking about what is this kind of thing. We need to have this kind of conversation with other people like ourselves, so that there is a sense of shared concern that is not primarily going to happen in the courthouse. You know, we need to say, what do you know about your neighbors? What do you know? I mean, I live on a street where there has been both drug and gun violence in the past. I haven't seen it. I just moved here, but I know that's been happening here. And so what am I going to do about that? Well, I'm going to have conversations about what is it that we want to, how do we want to live here on this block? And as a new member of this block, that's the conversation I've already begun to have with people who are my neighbors. And
just to challenge, not to challenge, just to ask you at those. So, you know, I totally understand what you're saying. I appreciate what you're saying, but again, is that dealing with the issue, or is that, you know, more of a protective mechanism? You know, so I think things like, you know, what we saw happen here in this court case is it's very much a protective mechanism, to your point, Stuart. But how we actually deal with the issue if you can't do it legally? What happens then if the street takes it on themselves to protect themselves, that takes it on themselves to start to, you know, or gated communities where you actually just lock everyone else and say, right, we're all going to be protected and that's all that matters? What happens to society then?
I'm not really talking about how we protect ourselves. Instead, I'm about how we live with one another. Because I think that's the problem. I bet if we really looked at this family, they were living in a form of isolation from influence that would have been beneficial to them if they had those relationships in their community.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I misunderstood. I understand what you're saying. It's humanity.
I think we're already in a position where people are arming themselves to protect themselves. That's already the condition, and so that's kind of the step before the legal, and both of those really are not advantageous, and so we have to be different if we're going to actually solve this problem, because I don't think what we've tried so far has worked at all. And I mean, I've been looking at this for a long time, and it only seems to be worse than it was 20 years ago when I was involved with the group back where I used to live.
I think we're in a much more combative society, and you can tell me, Chris, if the same thing is going on in your part of the world. But I mean, you look at our politics. It's
going on.
yeah, I mean, it's so distressing. The unwillingness of people to engage with people that don't think exactly like them. Whether it's in Congress, whether it's in social discussion, and certainly social media has accelerated it or exacerbated it. And then when you create this sense of combativeness, lack of respect for other people, lack of civility, and then you introduce a gun into that situation, I think it's much more likely you're going to see violence.
You're absolutely right, because the gun becomes an anger management tool. Instead of people talking like we are, unemotionally and discussing. I mean, when I was growing up, if two guys got upset with each other, they might get in a fist fight. But now the gun has become the anger management tool. So you take a step back and say, why are people so angry? And we've talked about that, and the cities are bad. I'm the first one to tell you the cities are very, very bad, because it's an aggressive environment, and people don't feel safe, and they feel like they have to carry a gun, and then somebody steps in front of somebody, and next thing you know, somebody wants to pull a gun, and that's their way of solving the problem instead of just blowing it off. So again, if it was a business problem, you'd say, what's the root cause?
And I think too, you've got sort of that ad hominem thing where you are actually blaming the person and despising and hating the person for their beliefs. If you can't have that civil debate, and then to your point, Stuart, what'll I do about it? I've got a gun. So you can sort of see it, right?
The other question I have is she simply being set up as a scapegoat, and therefore is returning everybody's sense of justice back to some kind of norm? And if she is the scapegoat, which if you're familiar with Renee Girard's mimetic desire theory, then we know that the scapegoat is the person who returns the community back to some kind of norm where they feel justice has been served. And I don't think justice was served. I just think it has just created another dimension to this problem that we're going to have to address as a society.
What about the families of the 4 people that got killed now? And I'm not advocating either way. Do you think they feel better because the mother was charged and convicted? Or do you think they were satisfied that the child was, that he pleaded guilty and that was the end of it?
Well, the question that I have with that is the sentence, is the punishment equivalent to the crime? And if you take a person's life, I'm not advocating for the death penalty, but I think that one of the questions that we face as we look at legal and justice issues is what is the appropriate penalty for the crimes that people are committing? I'll think of like Bernie Madoff, or Sam, whatever his name is. The people who steal billions of dollars. What is the appropriate proportional punishment for those crimes? And I don't think we have a very good way of understanding that. But that's the question that keeps coming back to me.
But other than putting the kid, behind bars for life, I personally don't believe in the death penalty. So other than doing that, what else can you see as a possible proportionate punishment? Is that both parents in jail for life as well, or I don't know.
Don't know that either. I really don't know. I don't have an answer to that.
I don't think there is an answer to that. In other words, there are two reasons for, or maybe two that turn into three reasons for punishment. It's punitive. You did something wrong. You deserve to suffer. One is the protection of society. And then aside from that is the deterrent effect. That when people know that if I do something, I'm going to have to pay for it, and if I get caught, I have less impetus to do it. And I think, we're living in a time when we're not real big on consequences in our day-to-day lives. And therefore the whole idea of the deterrent effect is diminished. If I don't live, well, I grew up, people my age grew up, if we did something our parents felt was wrong, you get a slap, you get a spanking, you get, my dad told me got the back of a knife on the back of his knuckles, and, and we don't do any of that anymore. I guess that's supposed to make us enlightened.
Mother say something like, LOL, I'm not mad, just don't get caught. Wasn't that the text?
I think the deterrent effect appeals to those who believe in the law. And if you don't believe in the law and you believe you're above the law, then the deterrent effect has no effect on it. It's almost a permission to go violate it. And that's where it was that thought I had several weeks ago about, as I was looking at something that said, are these punishments equivalent to the crimes that people are committing that particularly have a detrimental effect upon the whole society, or the whole community? And I don't have an answer to that, but it just seems like these are questions that we need to be talking more about.
It's impossible to give the lives back to the people that lost them. I mean, there's even a calculation where they could say how much generational wealth was lost because the people those kids that lost their life. Well, that they're never going to get that. The families are never going to get that. I mean, it's almost like a crime against history or society. Each of those four people may have had some sort of impact on their society, their families at some point in the future, and they'll never get a chance to realize that. But that can't be paid back. That can't be paid back because she goes to prison or he goes to prison. So the fundamental question is, deterrence doesn't work. We know that. So again, what's the root cause?
Well, I think, Ed, that's really interesting. You say, people aren't abiding by the law. They're disregarding the law. And is that because they feel a sense of injustice in their society towards themselves? And there's that loss of purpose within a community, that loss of, what is the greatest thing for the greatest good, that sort of utilitarian approach. And I mean, that does then go back to the United States, which has a much more sort of libertarian. So if we look at the individuals who are looking at themselves and looking at their rights and what's good for them, society's not delivering that. I don't know. I'm just riffing here and trying to work out why.
I think that's really interesting, and I hope I'd like to actually follow that up in the next segment, if you can stick around. But I want to wrap this up now. I just want to give you one brief story that my daughter-in-law was visiting, one of her first visits here to St. Louis from New York, and we were out. The family was out taking a walk, and we passed a house where a fellow was building a wall in his backyard. And my wife started asking me, how's it going? And how are you doing? And chatting back and forth. And okay, having a good day. We walked on, and my daughter-in-law said, "Do you know him?" And I said, "No." Just, people do that here. You just have conversations with people you don't know. In New York, it's that mass of people that you kind of have to create a psychological barrier. And that breaks down our sense of humanity. I think that it becomes unusual to talk to someone you don't know. Yeah, there are lots of elements here that contribute, and maybe we'll get a chance to talk about a few more. But for now, thank you all for really, really thoughtful and
Thank you.
insightful discussion.
Excellent.
Ed Brennigar, Chris Parker, Stuart Wiggins, thank you very much for being with me. For those of you who are watching or listening, if you have a topic you'd like us to take up, please go to my website, ethicsninja.com. Use the contact information. Send in your idea if it's compelling. We'll take it up for a future episode. And until then, as always, we encourage you to continue grappling with the gray.